This is part 2 of the video for Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is focusing on groups and networks. When last we talked about the material here, we considered the idea of weak ties, where ties ended up being the way in which people found some degree of connectivity among one another, and how weak ties actually might be quite useful because they provide unexpected ways in which individuals may be able to transmit information because they can relate to one another. Let's now consider networks from the perspective of 6 degrees. You may very well have heard of the phrase 6 degrees of separation, the name of a particular play. What you may not know is that 6 degrees reflects an experiment done by the sociologist in the name of Milgram, whom we've heard of before when we're doing the experiments involving the administration of pain. In this particular case, Milgram ends up using a series of chain letters to try to figure out how big networks are. And so, according to Milgram, it would take only 5 people for individuals to be able to relate to everyone else in the world. A subsequent researcher by the name of Watts found that at best, that would only work for half of the people in the world. But Watts also discovered that there were individuals who were more successful, who were better hubs for connecting with one another, and referred to them as super-connected. One of the things that you may get out of a network is the idea of social capital, the idea that the network itself has a value in excess of the individuals. So this might be an incentive to keep these individuals in a particular group, or in some way for the group to acquire power. Social capital, the idea of the knowledge or people of things in a network, may end up correlating with economic or political health, so that the better the kinds of capital one has, the better one's economic status. A researcher by the name of Putnam suggests that there has been a decline in social capital because families are experiencing less togetherness, that there are fewer group vacations, and overall lack of civil engagement. Why that is the case? You can take one perspective that ends up blaming a certain measure of divisiveness due to changes in social roles. Simply the idea that in a married couple, the woman is no longer taking care of the home, but is also working. Of course, the idea is to suggest that this is a mistake on the part of the woman to go outside of this environment. It doesn't take into account as a formulation the idea that there might be economic necessity behind it. In that particular theory, what you end up seeing is an overall change in society, that economic pressures are so great that it requires that both parents be working as a general rule. Still, why is social capital lacking in this particular society? If you go past economic necessity, you may also look at the idea of flexibility, that people find themselves able to find work and use it according to larger schedules or concerns, that you might see parents working respective shifts, if you will, one parent working a night shift and the other working during the day, where that would allow for each parent to provide childcare. One of the consequences of weaker ties may also be an increase in the sense of mobility, that people are able to move about more readily or easily, and that in turn may end up weakening communication. Ironically, even though we might have better mobile communication mechanisms in place, we may see that people are, that societies are more atomized, that people are not home as much as they used to, for example. Besides the tendency to look at some of this as a complaint against women not accepting a traditional role of staying at home and families, this might actually reflect something larger or cyclic in nature, depending on the economic strength in a particular society. Once circumstances change and it looks like it becomes more feasible, then maybe we go back to these more durable, better connected type social networks or communities. How do you understand social relations? engage in a kind of network analysis. What this ends up doing is being able to identify the way in which groups relate to one another, if you will, that they connect with one another, and that'll give you an idea better about how certain things can happen. So if you look at the idea of teenage sex, researchers might find that independent of any particular social impetus, that 50% of American teenagers over the age of 15 have engaged in sexual intercourse, and that 2/3 of them are having sex or participating in some form of sexual activity. Does this mean that there's something that's driving them? Not necessarily. It may be the social structures that are in place. Why would something like that matter? Well, look at the way in which sexually transmitted diseases might be communicated in young people. What this may end up meaning is an appreciation for the fact that networks may arise for these kinds of activities to take place. If we're engaging in network analysis, we may also look at how there are certain cycles or arrangements, groups of three, where you end up finding that the third plays one of those roles that we talked about earlier, like mediator, and that within a group of three we may end up finding a degree of connectedness or sharing, which might be impractical when we started to think of groups of four. We've been talking about different kinds of groups. Consider organizations, which involves some kind of a social network built around a common purpose that establishes a boundary between members within the organization and those without. We could have this being informal, where there are no real rules for how things happen or how the organization functions, versus formal, which does have attributes relating to how that particular organization functions and the rules by which people within the groups relate to one another. It's easy to contrast formal versus informal. What very well may be more likely the case is that these types of organizations may end up working along a continuum, where you might have at one end greater rigidity and form, versus the other end where there's informality to the point that begs the larger question of whether a group actually exists. Look at the way in which an organization may end up adopting a particular structure or culture. When we've talked about culture before, we've talked about it in terms of being shared beliefs and behaviors, and that in fact the irony may be is that these common interests or the common culture may be much akin to what was referred to or has been referred to as the old boys club, which basically means that within this particular organization there's a way of doing things, that things have been done this way forever. Contrast it with the way in which you'll see structure, which talks about distribution of power within a particular organization, how authority exists, and the ways in which we can see variations on it. So a particular organization might be something like an interlocking directorate. What's that mean? As a business form, a corporation has certain qualities to it. And typically, a corporation is more of a democratic kind of business form. We'll have owners who will have their ownership interest represented in terms of shares or stock. These individuals won't run the company directly, but they'll be able to use their proportional stock interest to vote in people who will manage the company on a larger scale. And these individuals will be considered directors. What happens when you have businesses that share one or two members on their boards of directors? And what you'll get effectively then is interlocking directorates, so that there's a kind of loose affiliation among different corporations, even if it turns out that they end up focusing on widely varied forms of business. But what you end up getting here is the added benefit of the sharing of knowledge and or power. This may sound very familiar to you, and a concept that will continue to pop up throughout this course of C. Wright Mill's idea of the power elite, if you will, much like the old boys network, of individuals whose parents had been in place and had known one another so that their offspring can end up trading on those relationships and perhaps continuing generationally the way in which those relationships can exist. A specialized form of organization has a quality known as isomorphism. When you end up seeing the development of organizations that roughly work the same way. So when you see credit card companies like the major ones such as Visa and MasterCard, they very well are not going to talk to one another about how they end up doing things, but they're going to end up doing much the same thing because this is the way in which their particular product will work most efficiently. So they won't necessarily have a swapping of data, but their ability to provide that particular service may be quite similar. So what you're seeing here is that the creation of organizations in response to the same environmental stimuli or cues means that even though they may not collaborate, they'll end up having many shared or common qualities. A last point here talks about the Hart-Celler Act and the way in which we saw this as a means of changing organization in this country. Particularly, what it ended up doing was eliminating the use of quotas when it came to immigrants to this particular country. On the one hand, what that did is eliminate some of the stereotypes that had existed regarding certain types of immigrants, presumptions that one particular group of people or cultures were better for the U.S. than for others. These kinds of quotas had been almost in place as a sign of xenophobia or a fear of the unknown, as being able to manage that. Things have changed. They're different, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're better, although probably the absence of a quota gives rise to different kinds of hopes and potentially an enrichment of organizations. So what you end up seeing here is, by sociologists, an interest about ways in which networks can develop and how they continue to exist. They can be something that can matter very much from generation to generation, much like you would see under Mills's description of the power elite, but also that you may see that something more frivolous ends up being passed along. The whole idea that we end up having a internet video that is so popular that it gets passed around quickly describes this as a viral video. Well, how does it that these particular factors arise or exist? Well, there may not be a simple answer to this, but it's pretty clear that without the YouTube and site and its channels, getting these things to go viral would be far more difficult. So perhaps by reducing the barriers to sharing these kinds of things, network analysis could see that since everyone could have access to this, that'll also mean greater ease of sharing types of information among this informal group or organization. Let me stop here with the video for Chapter 5, relatively short compared to other chapters. Chapter 6 is a little longer, but that's still to come.